made it through the post-lunch slump to be here. I'm Anna, this is Viv, and we're very lucky to be joined by Ellie, who was one of our students. And we're going to talk a bit about Law in the Community, which was a new module run in the law school for the first time last year. So before I talk a bit more about the module, I just want to give you a bit of background so you can sort of understand where it came from and why we did it. The law school has got a sort of history of pro bono. So Julie Price, who's one of our colleagues and worked on the module too, she's run lots of pro bono schemes over lots of years, and they are really aimed to help people who, for example, can't afford legal advice. So we created an umbrella module integrating 3 of our schemes into the curriculum, and we did that for a number of reasons. So first of all, the way forward strategy, there's a kind of goal of getting more people in placement. Secondly, and I think one of the most important reasons really, was about making pro bono accessible to a wider range of students. So pro bono is something that on your CV helps you into a legal career, but we have increasing numbers of students who are working an awful lot alongside their degree to support themselves, and probably don't have the time to do this as an optional extra. So it's a way of getting a wider range of students involved in these schemes. There is also a sort of slightly pragmatic reason for this. As probably lots of you will know, resourcing these sorts of schemes can be really tricky. It relies on staff goodwill, staff don't always have the time, it can be very ad hoc. So, you know, having things in the curriculum is a way of making sure they're properly resourced. So that's the sort of background to what we were doing. Very briefly then, this sort of the way we did this. We had an overarching umbrella module, which had broad learning outcomes. As I said, there were 3 different streams involved in it, and we'll talk a bit more about those a bit later. But the idea was broad learning outcomes that we could adapt to each of the different streams as appropriate, broad assessment parameters, so 20% sort of oral presentation assessment, 80% sort of written or coursework, but with flexibility to adapt that to the needs of the different streams. So I ran 2 of the streams with Julie, the personal support unit and victim support streams, and Viv ran the rugby stream, and Viv is going to tell you a bit more about that.
Okay, well, moving to the WRU scheme. In this scheme, students help small community rugby clubs with their legal problems. So we're not talking about clubs like the Cardiff Blues or the Scarlets. We're talking about small clubs, often in quite deprived areas of South Wales, where the rugby club can actually be quite a hub of the community. So the students help with specific problems, but they also support clubs which are thinking of converting to limited company status. Now that's something that the WRU is particularly keen to encourage, because for the majority of clubs at the moment, and all the clubs are usually run by volunteers, but for clubs which are not companies, if something goes wrong at the club, say they're sued for some reason, it's those volunteers who may be personally at risk of being sued personally if as representing the club. So at least becoming a company may mitigate some of that risk. The legal issues involved are really pretty complex, and not only do the students have to deal with the legal issues themselves, but it is very important that they develop the skills to communicate and discuss those difficult issues with the non-professional people, volunteers running the club. So it is challenging work, and it can be challenging for tutors as well as students. On the assessed module, we had 11 students on this WRU stream. So 11 students were actually enrolled, plus there were some students who were doing the module, or rather who were on the scheme on an extracurricular basis. So these were invited to come along whenever they could, and they did take part as well. We had 2 tutors, myself and Julie Price. So Julie had a part to play in all 3 streams. We shared the teaching and assessment. It was really helpful having 2 of us, particularly on assessment of oral skills, to provide a degree of continuity across the streams and within the streams. The basic teaching model on this particular stream was a 2-hour workshop every week, and students had work to do, preparation and meetings to attend outside that. Now the learning outcomes on this sort of scheme are very much dictated by the needs of the scheme, particularly week on week. And whereas some of those can be anticipated and planned, by the tutor. For example, we know some of the underlying law that needs to be facilitated and the knowledge that students need to acquire. Other learning outcomes are not so easily predicted and very much depend on what's coming up from week to week. So you do need to be quite flexible. There were quite a few meetings that all the students attended. We had some meetings with the clubs that we were working with, and a few students actually managed to attend those meetings with clubs, although all students were working on the particular clubs we were involved in. But every student on the module, plus some of the extracurricular students, also had 2 meetings at the WIU HQ to discuss matters with the commercial director, partly about the aims of getting as many clubs incorporated as possible, and also to do with a questionnaire that we were helping the WRU with. And we also had a meeting at Hugh James Solicitors where we discussed some property issues with the property partner. And it's actually these meetings that I'd like to focus on very briefly rather than the meetings with the clubs, because whereas we did a lot of preparation for the content of those meetings, what the students were going to say, etc., we all planned and worked on that as teams. And every student, I'm very happy to say, took part in the actual meetings themselves. But an additional value for law students very much came from being in those professional environments, seeing how the experts interacted, how they communicated, and so forth. And some of the skills and the insights that can be derived from that sort of opportunity can be quite subtle and maybe experienced quite differently from one student to the next. And from a teaching point of view, they can be quite difficult to capture in learning outcomes or assessment criteria. But for authentic learning, they do need to be articulated in some way, which brings me to assessment, because I was really impressed by how strongly the students articulated and reflected on the value of those meetings in their oral presentations. And I must confess that for me as a tutor, I was converted from something of a reflection skeptic to someone who can now actually see the value of that type of assessment. Having said that, it was only a small part. The whole oral assessment was 20% of the assessment, and the reflective element was half of that. I'd be happy to discuss the other 80% if anyone's interested, but time doesn't permit for the moment, so back to Anna.
So I'm going to touch very briefly on the other 2 streams just to kind of give you some context, but then I'll let Ellie talk about them because her experience is probably much more interesting to you. So for those of you who don't know, Victim Support is a national charity and they run inbound call lines for victims of crime. And the Personal Support Unit is a unit at the court that is there to assist people, litigants in person, so people who do not have legal advice. So on these 2 streams, we had students who were doing 15 days of placements at either Victim Support or the Personal Support Unit, so quite different to the rugby stream, but within the same module. So there was some kind of initial teaching for context, what's the background to all this, why is pro bono so important now with legal aid cuts and so on. And again, we had an assessed presentation reflecting on experiences, and we allowed students to choose the topic of their written assessment. But I will let Ellie talk about her experiences of being on the stream.
Hi, so I was part of the Personal Support Unit stream, and I was based down at Cardiff Family and Civil Justice Courts, obviously here in Cardiff. For me, the Law in the Community module was sort of is and continues to be my most formative module that I've done at the university. I think for me, the ability to both have a more practical module whilst being a law student and also get exposure to the courtroom and also just assisting clients in the real world is something that's really helped me. And in no small part had a huge part to play in me getting a training contract this summer. So obviously what you would hope the majority of law students that want to practice will do. I was asked to sort of think about some things that I would look to change in the future. For me personally, obviously this is a 1-year-old module, so it's very new, but I found that with the assessment, only really did I get to talk about my placement and what I was learning in the real world in the 20% presentation. And for someone that really threw themselves into the placement, that was something that I think we've all said that we'd like to build upon more, because if you're doing really well in your placement, then you obviously want that to equate to doing well here at the university. Second of all, I think the sort of training aspects, talking about getting people trained a bit earlier, because with the flexibility with the 15 days, you can start before the academic year. So I actually started last June. But obviously I was there for a good few months before I actually got any sort of training, which was maybe a bit questionable. But for me, helped me to actually learn authentically, which is the theme of the day, And also, I would say that this module really speaks to us teaching law in the real world, which is, when I've worked with other students, been something they're really interested in getting involved in when they come up to Cardiff University.
Thanks very much, Ellie. We just need to close with a few thoughts on why perhaps using an umbrella module to deliver several small schemes might have potential for the future and for other people who are thinking of running this kind of module. And if we look at the challenges which can typically arise, this is just some of them, it often does work best on small scale projects. The sorts of modules that people tend to come up with tend to be optional, and indeed this is an optional module. And of course, student choices fluctuate from year to year. So what's incredibly popular one year may have no student take up the next. Similarly, you have staff changes, and as you know, a particular member of staff may have particular expertise or research interest. If they move on, everything can grind to a halt. At the same time, as we're aware, there tends to be a drive in higher education for more standardisation, more efficiency, less complexity in module offerings and processes. And I think that is at least part of some of the messages coming out of Transforming Cardiff, if I've understood them correctly. So reducing unnecessary complexity. Added to that, internal approval processes for introducing new modules and discontinuing old ones. They need quite a long lead-in time. The process itself can take a while. And of course, you may not know about the student take-up until just before the beginning of the year. So what might an umbrella module assist with in that respect? Well, continuity, first of all, because the overall module can be developed and refined from year to year. Flexibility, so that new streams can be added and perhaps old ones removed, and they have a ready-made framework when they do slot in. Viability overall for the module, so as individual streams may fluctuate, the overall module maintains a meaningful size. Efficiency from several points of view. You've got the same administrative processes, and this assists with professional services staff, and you can have some kind of streamlining with the processes. And ideally, you'll have a small body of tutors who are at least assessing across several streams and ideally teaching, although that may not always be practical. This was our first year at running this. We're still working on it. There are lots of things that we're still need to be refined. Assessment still needs a lot of work. Because we're going into things like presentations and reflections, we need to consider additional criteria and also how we support students for those assessments. For example, there are lots of other assessment related things that we'd like to work on as well. Learning Central, because it's one module, it has one place on Learning Central, however many streams you have. So although professional services staff in our school were very helpful in terms of keeping the different streams separate, there was an element of having to use more levels and folders and things like that to keep them usable. The module documentation itself, the umbrella module is necessarily broad, and the way we're kind of dealing with the streams within that is rather more direct communication with students so that they know what they're signing up to. So there's a lot of tweaking to be done there. But nonetheless, it may offer some possibilities for trying to square that circle of different pressures on modules. So I think that's all we wanted to say. Very happy to discuss or answer questions if we have the time. Oh, 1 minute over. No? How are we doing?
Let's have one question.
Any questions? Any thoughts? Hello.
One quick question, if I may. So if you've got the different streams and you're keeping those separate within the module, is there any advantage to not keeping them separate, to somehow merging them and looking at the joint learning that have come out from the different experience and where there were similarities and differences and getting students to showcase that, perhaps on a discussion board or something?
There might be possibilities in some streams. We have to say the three are very different, but I think there are more similarities in yours than
so the PSU, the Victim Support, they had a sort of common framework of lectures and so on, and the idea is to try and sort of integrate that more, but I think there probably is scope in terms of the sort of online. I think one of the things that we really found with the module actually is a PSU group particularly, they had their own WhatsApp groups. They kind of actually created very much of that community for themselves. which was really nice to see.
Students as well, so some of the ones that were on victim support and us PSU ones, particularly at the start of the year, did mix in a lot. So we were getting used to being in our more professional placements and did talk to each other. But I think it's something that will be integrated more.